As part of my AP capstone research, you will be learning about the parallels between Harry Potter and the Holocaust as a new method to teach the Holocaust. You just took a diagnostic test, and now we're going to start the lesson. Take notes on this video. You will need to use them at the end of this study, and you will only have your notes. Here's a little history of anti-Semitism. It existed long before the Holocaust. There was an attack on Jews in Frankfurt, Germany in 1614, and Jews were forced to wear a yellow ring on their clothes. Hitler and the Nazi Party took advantage of these pre-existing anti-Jewish feelings among the German population and started rumors about the Jews. Prior to the Holocaust, Jews mostly lived in cities, and they made up a diverse community. They were professionals like doctors and lawyers, as well as leading intellectuals and academics who influenced the Western world. They represented a diversity of political views and opinions. All of this was lost in the Holocaust. According to the Nazis, the Germans lost World War I because of the Jews. Democracy was a Jewish invention, and the Germans had been forced to become a democracy. The Jews were engaged in a conspiracy for world domination, and they controlled society and made the Germans suffer. Along with these, the myth that dominated German society for centuries was that the Jews killed Christ. The Germans were already suspicious of the Jews before they came to power, the Nazis that is. Jews made up less than 1% of the population in Germany. Most of them identified as German, and most Germans had never met a Jewish person before and would have found it difficult to distinguish one anyway. They spoke the same language and dressed the same way. But a long history of anti-Semitism and religious prejudice made them the perfect scapegoat. There were few Jews in the country, and their political power was limited, so they had a difficult time defending themselves against the Nazi hate campaign. This gave rise to Nazi racial ideology, which defined racial makeup as a person's characteristics, abilities, attitudes, and behavior. Hitler drew from ideas of 19th century German social Darwinists. For example, he adopted the survival of the fittest theory, which stated that survival of a race depended upon its ability to reproduce, supply the population, and maintain the purity of the gene pool. It had to preserve the unique racial characteristics. Since all races were in a struggle for survival and expansion, violent conflict between races was inevitable. This was Hitler's justification for persecuting the Jews, a competing race. Social Darwinists affixed stereotypes of ethnic group appearance, behavior, and culture. They believed that these stereotypes were rooted in biological inheritance and were therefore unchangeable. The Nazis believed that the assimilation of a member of one race into another was impossible. Their original racial traits could not change. They could only degenerate through racial mixing. Hitler believed in a hierarchy of races in which the Germans were members of a superior group of races that he called Aryan. The German Aryan race was biologically gifted above all other races and was thus destined to expand and rule a vast empire. Hitler claimed that the Aryan race was threatened by intermarriage and procreation with other inferior races. Thus, Hitler asserted that Germany had to invade other territories and create a vast empire to preserve the Aryan race's biological destiny of being a master race. Let's see how this all ties in with Harry Potter. In the series, racism functions as an ideology. Race is defined as a group of people with something in common, and the problem of racial discrimination becomes all-encompassing and creates class struggles and other problems. the wizarding world, society is divided into classes based on blood status. On top are the purebloods, followed by half-bloods and then muggle-borns. Purebloods are superior because they are descendants of 100% wizarding lineage. Here's a little history. Wizards once coexisted with muggles, but they became outcasts because of their differences. They created a community that shut muggles out. They hid and protected their magic in this way. Due to this, there was a growing disfavor toward muggles throughout history. This led to further divisions within the wizarding community because Muggle-born wizards were wizards with no magical lineage, so the closer a wizard was to becoming a Muggle-born, the closer they were to being a Muggle, who didn't belong in the wizarding world. Thus, Muggle-borns had the lowest status, despite the fact that they displayed abilities equal to or superior to those of purebloods. Take Hermione Granger, for example, who is extremely gifted in her magical abilities, although she's a Muggle-born. Purebloods often call her a filthy mudblood. When Hogwarts was founded, one of the founders, Salazar Slytherin, rallied against Muggleborns. He was a pureblood and worried that Muggles and wizards' relations would dismantle the wizarding world. He said that his descendants should take ardent actions against Muggles, and the separation continued to deepen between the two groups. Lord Voldemort, the central villain of Harry Potter and a descendant of Slytherin, carried out Slytherin's original plan with the help of his followers, called Death Eaters. They took advantage of the current attitude and uncertainty about Muggles and perpetuated a racial ideology of pureblood superiority. Voldemort and his most ardent followers wished to eradicate Muggle-born wizards to restore the blood purity of the wizarding world. Half-bloods did not have as high of a status as purebloods because procreation between wizards and muggles was denounced by purebloods. It tainted the purity and dominance of the wizarding world. With the dwindling supply of purebloods, the wizarding world was believed to be under threat. So let's step back. That was a lot of information. Here's how it all connects. First, the Holocaust was preceded by historical anti-Semitism, and the wizarding world had a historical anti-Muggle sentiment. Second, Hitler took advantage of the anti-Jewish attitude in Germany to create the Nazi Party and his own racial ideology. Voldemort took advantage of the attitude toward Muggles to create his own army and racial ideology. Third, Hitler had no true justification for demoting the Jews, and Voldemort had no true justification for demoting Muggles. Last, the Aryan race and the pureblood race were superior in their respective worlds. We went over the history, so now we'll focus on dehumanization. In Nazi Germany, Jews experienced branding and other forms of cruel and discriminatory identification. They gave Jews numbers or symbols to wear as their identities. The Germans dehumanized the Jews and made them outcasts. Here's an excerpt from a woman's diary during the Holocaust. They tattooed me and they told us, from now on, this is your name. My name is A5143. Your name is your number. And the discouragement that I felt like I was not a human person anymore. This dehumanization soon took legislative form with the Nuremberg Laws. These were laws created by the Nazi Party that institutionalized many of the racial theories in Nazi ideology. They excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship, prohibited them from marrying or having sexual relations with people of German blood, and disenfranchised Jews and deprived them of most of their political rights. One of these laws was the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, which stated, marriages between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood are forbidden. marriages concluded in defiance of this law are void, even if, for the purpose of evading this law, they were concluded abroad. Sexual relations outside marriage between Jews and nationals of German or kindred blood are forbidden. Jews are forbidden to display the Reich and national flag or the national colors. The Jews were stripped of their German identities and were seen as impure. Another law is the Reich citizenship law, which stated, "A citizen of the Reich is that subject only who is of German or kindred blood, and who, through his conduct, shows that he is both desirous and fit to serve the German people and Reich faithfully. The right to citizenship is acquired by the granting of Reich citizenship papers. Only the citizen of the Reich enjoys full political rights in accordance with the provision of the laws." Jews were not included in this. Now, let's see how this ties in with Harry Potter. It was theorized that Muggle-borns may have tricked a wizard into giving them their magical abilities. It was not understood how a person without magical parents could be as magically proficient as a pureblood. A Muggle-born registry was a law created by the Ministry of Magic, which was the governing body of the wizarding world. This stated that where no proven wizarding ancestry exists, the so-called Muggle-born is likely to have obtained magical powers by theft or force. The ministry is determined to root out such usurpers of magical power, and to this end has issued an invitation to every so-called Muggle-born to present themselves for interview by the newly appointed Muggle-born Registration Commission. This Muggle-born Registration Commission took wands away from Muggle-borns on the suspicion that they had stolen them from real wizards. This governing body called them to the Ministry of Magic, which was now corrupted and controlled by Voldemort and his followers, called Death Eaters. The Muggle-borns were interrogated about from whom they stole their wands. They were stripped of their rights as wizards and essentially were dehumanized. Here is an excerpt of one Muggle-born being questioned by Dolores Umbridge, head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission. She had her wand taken away, and she was questioned by Umbridge vigorously until she started crying, because Umbridge kept insisting that she was not a witch or wizard, and only witches or wizards had wands. So she insisted that Miss Cattermole had taken another wizard's wand. Muggles were also imprisoned in Azkaban for supposedly stealing magic and teaching about and denouncing propaganda against Muggles and Muggle-borns. Hogwarts did not allow any Muggle-born students once Voldemort and his followers took over, so Muggle-borns were denied a magical education. More wizarding rights were denied to them because they were not considered wizards by the general public under Voldemort's reign. So here's a summary of the new parallels we just discussed. The Jews were stripped of their rights as German citizens, and Muggle-borns were stripped of their wizarding right to have a wand. The Jews were no longer allowed to participate in or identify with German culture, and Muggle-borns were no longer accepted or allowed to participate in wizarding culture. Let's move on to propaganda, another important theme of the Holocaust. Hitler had established a one-party state, and the next step was to win the allegiance of the German people and unite them behind his rule. Propaganda had to present a simple message to a mass audience. The German people had to believe they were involved in an urgent struggle with an enemy, an evil enemy. The Nazi Party turned the state-owned broadcasting system into a propaganda vehicle. Radio reached a mass audience and became the most pervasive source of Nazi propaganda. Through the radio, Nazis told stories about good deeds done by the noble young Aryan men of the Hitler Youth Organization and carried Hitler's speeches. The Nazis also gained influence due to their instillment of fear in others. If an individual's Jewish identity could not be concealed, he or she had to go into hiding. Jews had to be very careful because many of their neighbors could have been Nazi spies. If the spies found out that a family was Jewish, that family would be sent away to a concentration camp without warning, which instilled fear in other families. The Nazis also threatened that those who harbored information or were helping Jews hide would be punished as well. The Nazi Party gained significant support because becoming a supporter of the Nazi Party led to power and security. People who supported Hitler's actions may not have shared his beliefs, but most of them simply feared that they and their families would be in danger if they did not side with Hitler. In this way, Hitler gathered millions of supporters, consisting of those who shared his ideals and those who feared his punishments. Let's connect this to Harry Potter now. In the last book, Harry witnesses the mass printing of propaganda pamphlets titled Mudbloods and the Dangers They Pose to a Peaceful Pureblood Society. These were published by the Ministry of Magic under Voldemort's control and expressed the anti-Muggle sentiment and the Death Eaters' belief about Muggle rights or lack thereof. Here's a description of what the pamphlet looked like. Its pink cover was emblazoned with a gold title, Mudbloods and the Dangers They Pose to a Peaceful Pureblood Society, and it had a red rose with a simpering face in the middle of its petals, being strangled by a green weed with fangs and a scowl. Basically, the face being strangled is a Muggle-born, and that's what the Death Eaters thought should be done to Muggles. Now, this picture is from the movie, but you get the idea. As for Voldemort's instillment of fear, while some of his Death Eaters were truly sadistic, most of them stayed with him and carried out his orders because he would kill them and their families if they disobeyed. They would have a high status and abundant wealth if they sided with Voldemort. They would have a superior pureblood status. Let's go back to the Holocaust and look at the one role we haven't yet examined, the role of the bystander. Most of the German people were aware of the persecution of the Jews, but many were too afraid to do anything about it, or they were indifferent about it if it did not directly affect them. It was easier to refrain from involvement. This is similar in Harry Potter. While every wizard knew about Voldemort and his persecution of Muggles, most were too afraid to stop him or resist. It was very easy for Voldemort and his Death Eaters to kill people with magic and little opposition. However, at the Battle of Hogwarts, all of the students who had suffered under the control of Death Eaters at Hogwarts fought against Voldemort as a united force, and they eventually defeated them. As you can see, being an activist rather than a bystander can give you a significant role. Here are the parallels we just went over. The Nazis issued propaganda against Jews through the media, and the wizarding world had anti-Muggle pamphlets that were mass-produced and distributed. Hitler's instillment of fear forced many people to side against Jews in return for their family's security. Voldemort made wizards fear that those who did not side with Voldemort suffered a low status and the risk of being killed by his Death Eaters. In both worlds, there were many bystanders, but a few who resisted and made a difference. Now that we have all this information, why is it important? Through the themes of prejudice, bigotry, and racial hatred and their terrible consequences, we have to learn from history. We learn about the Holocaust so that a similar event never occurs again. We have to remember that history like that still applies to our society. Human rights improve the protection of human beings and are unalienable. They protect human dignity, they provide every nation with a universal concept for human rights laws, and they can foster taking action to uphold human rights. Shockingly, many young people, and even people alive during World War II, cannot define the Holocaust and have never heard of Nazism. It seems surprising. We need to be educated because of the dangers of prejudice in our society. One of the main lessons of the Holocaust is that cultural diversity, racial diversity, ideological diversity, etc., are key to a harmonious society so that all groups of people coexist and no single group is superior. The purpose of this lesson was to give a little more meaning to the Holocaust and relate it to you guys, because at the end of the day, the Holocaust is pretty distant, but Harry Potter, the characters are around our age, and they're a little more relatable than the people in pictures. If you look at these numbers, it's pretty unbelievable. And for many of you, it just might not feel real because it was in the past and it doesn't seem like something as atrocious as the Holocaust could ever happen. We haven't ever been touched by something like it. But that distant part of history will always have themes that relate to our society. That is why this is important. The victims of the Holocaust were not just statistics. They were real people who experienced prejudice, hatred, ethnic cleansing, and the loss of their once prosperous, happy lives. I hope you learned something today. You will now use your notes to complete the post-test your teachers will hand out. Thank you so much for participating in this study.